Hey everybody, this is a book review uh, by Ernest Haberkern of, uh, shows the full title, Max Shachtman and His Left, A Socialist Odyssey Through the American Century by Peter Drucker. I want to read this biography eventually, but it's kind of difficult. I've been having trouble getting my hands on it, so if anyone can show me a direct thing, I've looked at a lot of the usual places for it, can't find it. If you try to buy it online, it's like $1 million. So it's kind of like a lost treasure. But we'll see. This is like the blurb at the beginning. It says two distinct currents emerged after 1940 from the Trotskyism of two distinct currents emerged after 1940 from the Trotskyism of Trotsky. One was the official, quote, orthodox Trotskyism of James P. Cannon, Ernest Mandel, Michel Pablo, Jerry Healy, Ted Grant, etc. The other was mainly associated with the name of Max Shachtman. The British Socialist Workers' Party is a hybrid owing more to the former than the latter. The Shachtman current mutated into a number of tendencies. Shachtman himself ended his days as a sort of American Fabian, but its history remains a matter of great importance for those engaged in the work of renewing Trotskyism in the post-Stalinist world. Ernest Haberkern examines Max Shachtman and His Left, A Socialist Odyssey Through the American Century by Peter Drucker. One thing I need to get clear with myself is like whether third camp necessarily means third camp Trotskyism, right? Because in my um, recollection of reading Haberkern's book, Theories of Bureaucratic Collectivism and whatnot, neither capitalism nor socialism, Theories of Bureaucratic Collectivism, he doesn't really seem to be saying anything about reorganizing the vanguard or like getting the revitalizing Trotskyism or something like that. He always speaks of socialism. Now this piece, however, is from Workers' Liberty, which would call itself a Trotskyist organization, I believe. Let me look it up real quick. Yeah, definitely calls itself Trotskyist. I don't know why I even had to look that up. I knew that. Anyway, here we go. Biographies are hard to do well. On the one hand, like a novelist, you are telling a story. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. You have to get the reader interested in the drama. On the other hand, unfortunately, real lives, unlike fictional ones, aren't usually well plotted. There are subplots that just fizzle out, loose ends that are never wound up, and odd twists and turns that don't seem consistent with what led up to them. And a biography, unlike a work of fiction, is also a reference work. The reader expects, and has a right to expect, that the important details are all there and are accurately reported. Accuracy in the details is as vital in a biography as it is in a dictionary or a telephone book. In the first task, the biography succeeds. The book is a good read. The reader's attention is caught and held by the intrinsic interest of this history. Is the history of the resistance of a section of the American left during World War II and the early Cold War, the period when the foundations of the modern security state were laid, and the American Republic radically transformed in order to defend the, quote, free world, end quote. First from the threat of Nazism, then from the threat of Stalinism, Peter Drucker's portrait of this band of American dissidents is as dramatic and compelling as the subject itself. Is the author's failure to measure up to the second task that undermines the book. Details are wrong or out of focus. Difficulties and contradictions are glossed over. If the story seems to hang together, it is also a little glib. It seems to hang together just because the details have been slighted. The reader is left with the uneasy feeling that while the experience has, like the carnival, been enjoyable, not all the acts were what they seemed to be. New section. Max Shachtman's Private Property. The title of the book itself is a distortion. Neither the Workers' Party nor the Independent Socialist League could be rightly called Max Shachtman's Left. no political tendency on the American left, and few internationally, were as free of, as hostile to, the politics of the leadership cult as the third camp tendency. In America, you would have to go back to the pre-World War I Socialist Party to find an equivalent in this respect. The, quote, cult of personality, end quote, became, especially after Trotsky's death, a characteristic trait of all the other groups that claimed his legacy. Norman Thomas, to take an example, from the opposite wing of the American anti-Stalinist left, never felt bound by the decisions or debates of his movement. He was Mr. Socialism, and as its presidential candidate for life, determined what the party's real position was. This is not a personal failing. It should not be taken as any special criticism of Thomas, whose positive role in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s has been underestimated, in my opinion. The concept of the socialist sect as the emanation of its leader was all-pervasive. You didn't have to make any effort to fall into this pattern. You just had to do what came naturally in the era of fascism and Stalinism. The Workers' Party and the Independent Socialist League never referred to themselves as, quote, Shachtmanites, end quote. That was an insult, a belittling term of contempt used by their opponents. And this insistence on democratic procedure, on a refusal to grant any member privileged status, was inextricably tied to the tendency's politics. It followed directly from their rethinking of the tradition of the Comintern and the Trotskyist movement that derived from it. And no one was clearer or wrote and spoke more eloquently on this question than Shachtman. Drucker, following the regrettable practice of academic historians, never makes explicit his own political hostility to the politics of the third camp, and especially its rejection of the ersatz, quote, Leninism, end quote, of the Third International. There's a footnote here. Let me find the footnote. Maybe it's an endnote. But the piece is so short that the endnotes aren't far away. So let's see. Footnote says, it would be a digression here to describe in any detail the origin and meaning of, quote, ersatz Leninism, end quote. I would only point out here the irony of it all. This, quote, Leninism, end quote, which Lenin never heard of and of which had nothing to do with his political career or thought, was invented by Grigory Zinoviev for the specific purpose of dishing Trotsky. Since Trotsky had never understood what Lenin was trying to do organizationally, he could only throw up his hands, admit that Lenin had been right on this point, while he had been mistaken, and pass on to his followers Zinoviev's proto-Stalinist ideas on party organization. That's a fascinating sentence. I'm going to repeat that. Since Trotsky had never understood what Lenin was trying to do organizationally, Trotsky could only throw up his hands, admit that Lenin had been right on this point, while he had been mistaken, and pass on to his own followers Zinoviev's proto-Stalinist ideas on party organization. I need to know more about Zinoviev. Very important figure, but I do not know much about him. Anyway, end footnote. Back to where I was. It may even be that in describing this tendency as, quote, Shachtman's left, end quote, Drucker doesn't understand how wrong he is. It is probable that Drucker is incapable of conceiving of an organization that is democratic and revolutionary. At one point, Drucker pretty much says that as long as the, quote, Shachtmanites, end quote, were revolutionary, they were, quote, Leninists, end quote. And when they stopped being, quote, Leninists, end quote, they stopped being revolutionaries. Footnote. Let's go back to the footnotes. Peter Drucker, Max Shachtman and his left, Humanities Press, page 272. All right, back to where we were. In reality, the rejection of ersatz, quote, Leninism, end quote, was part of the tendency's politics from the beginning. I do not think this conscious falsification by Drucker. I think he is genuinely confused as Trotsky was on this point. This excuse will not suffice to explain the other main distortion in Drucker's presentation. In describing the political tendency that defined itself by its adherence to the political position of the third camp as, quote, Max Shachtman's left, end quote, Peter Drucker glosses over the fact that the major decisions and theoretical documents of the tendency were not only not authored by Shachtman, but were opposed by Shachtman. Some Shachtman later accepted with more or less grace, others he simply ignored. In his conclusion, to take the most serious example of this obfuscation, Drucker refers somewhat offhandedly to the theory of bureaucratic collectivism, which, quote, Shachtman developed in 1940 and 1941, end quote, as, quote, only one highlight, end quote, illustrating the original contribution Shachtman made to Marxist theory and politics in the early 1940s. Now, in fact, the theory of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, and the third camp politics that lay behind the theory of bureaucratic collectivism are the main reasons why anyone is at all interested in this particular branch of the American Trotskyist movement. They are also the main reasons why people are interested in Max Shachtman. Certainly why I'm interested in Max Shachtman. The Workers' Party, the Independent Socialist League, and the Independent Socialist Clubs of the 1960s were never large organizations where they exercised serious influence on larger and more influential movements. In the trade unions, especially the United Auto Workers Union, in the 1940s, in the civil rights and peace movements in the 1950s, and in the New Left in the 1960s. It was because of their distinctive political ideas on the nature of socialism and the practical political conclusions those ideas led to. To my understanding, this is where the American left communist, rest in peace, he just died, Lauren Goldner, got his start in radical politics, was participation in the Independent Socialist Club that existed in Berkeley. He moved on from like third camp Trotskyist positions to left communist positions. But I think his that's definitely where he got his start. So also one of the main anarchist communist authors in this period, Wayne Price, who wrote a book from third camp, from Shachtmanite Trotskyism to anarchism, which is featured on this channel, also got his start in Shachtmanite Trotskyism. So there's an interesting kind of like, always an interesting dynamic to me, and that's why I take such an interest in Trotskyism, even though I'm not a Trotskyist and I'm not a Leninist, is that the reason I find them interesting is because I'm interested, Lauren Goldner, for instance, talks about how, like, what you could say was the ultra-left, to a large extent, was, like, to the left of Trotskyism. So I feel like in order to, like, understand what one's politics are, you kind of have to, like, think of, like, or, like, anything, you kind of have to, when you're trying to do, like self-identify, you're trying to, like, or figure out your own politics or who you are in any capacity, is kind of like, in my mind, I don't know, maybe this is just ridiculous, but in my mind, think of the people who, like, think the most likely like you, but there's some differences that are visible, and then try to, like, figure out what the specificities of those differences are, and then you can kind of, like, understand what your own identity is, right? So that's kind of why I I'm not a Trotskyist myself, but there's so much work from this kind of like these like about Trotskyism and the Trotskyist debates. It's kind of like understanding like why I'm not a Trotskyist and what are the differences between what my values and commitments and understandings are versus people that are similar to me in a lot of respects. Anyway. Certainly this tendency's intellectual influence, which was considerable, stemmed from its critique of the Soviet Union. In both respects, it continued the tradition of Leon Trotsky more successfully than that of other tendencies that claimed his mantle. To take the most prominent example, Drucker and other historians rightly recognized the role played by the Workers' Party in the trade unions during World War II as its most significant practical achievement. This small group filled the vacuum created when every other political tendency on the left abandoned the fight not only for trade union rights but for democratic rights in general. No abandoning is the No, abandoning is the wrong word. The left during the war meant the Communist Party and its supporters. They were the drill sergeants who disciplined the troops in the assault against those, quote, subversives, end quote, whose whinnying threat, whinnying, I don't know if it's a W. Let me see. Whinge. I don't know if that's what the word is, but whinging. Which means complaining in a peevish and irritating way. Where am I? The communists and their supporters were the drill sergeants who disciplined the troops in the assault against those, quote, subversives, end quote, whose whinging threatened the war effort. Footnote. It is the eternal shame of the American historical profession that no one left or right has written up this story. The imprisonment of Japanese Americans in concentration camps, the witch hunting of even the mildest dissent, the vicious race campaign that softened up the American people to the point that they could blandly accept the mass murder of civilian populations in Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, to name a few, all remain confined to monographs. And the incomplicity of the left is almost unmentioned. It is as if, quote, denazification, end quote, in Germany had been confined to a couple of small books on one or two incidents published by small presses. I believe, to my extent, that the American Communist Party celebrated the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, supported the imprisonment of Japanese Americans into internment camps during the war. And I don't really know much about the civilian population of Dresden, but I have heard that the American Communist Party did support the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as the internment of Japanese Americans, amongst other reactionary things that they supported during World War II. Anyway, where am I? End footnote, back to the text. Even the majority Trotskyists who began with more trade union influence were sidelined. In part, this was a result of government persecution, but it was also a function of their politics. If, as the, quote, orthodox Trotskyists, end quote, of the Socialist Workers' Party believed, the future of socialism was at stake when the Nazi invaders threatened the collectivized property won by the October Revolution, how could they vigorously pursue the class struggle against the Soviet Union's most important military ally? They could do it in theory, but not in practice. The theory of bureaucratic collectivism was not one contribution of the third camp tendency. It was the theoretical basis of the politics that defined that tendency. And Max Shachtman spent most of his political life attacking that position, first from a pro-Soviet point of view similar to that of Trotsky's, and then from a pro-West anti-communist point of view. The man who was responsible for the theory was Drucker's own research. The man who was responsible for the theory was, as Drucker's own research documents, Joseph Carter. There are all kinds of secondary and personal reasons why Carter's contribution has been denigrated and Shachtman's inflated. There usually are when you are dealing with real life rather than fiction. For one thing, Carter was a serious thinker who, as far as one can tell, suffered from a writer's block and had very little charisma. Max Shachtman, on the other hand, was a prolific and facile writer, and by all accounts, I never met him myself, had far more charisma than was good for him. More important was the fact that Shachtman was already a person of some standing in the Trotskyist movement. His book on the Moscow trials, which is still worth reading today, was not just a sectarian pamphlet of no interest to those outside of a charmed circle. The left and the American intelligentsia in the 1930s was on the left followed the debate over the trials with passionate concern. That Shachtman was chosen to write this major public account said something about his importance in the movement, as did the fact that in the first debate over the Russian question, it was Shachtman who wrote the brief for the Trotskyist majority against the dissidents like Ivan Crépieux, James Burnham, and Joseph Carter. When in 1940 Carter first proposed the heretical notion that Stalinism was a new class, neither capitalist nor socialist, his supporters, people like Hal Draper and Emanuel Geltman, were young new recruits. Valued comrades, of course, but not on the same level as Shachtman. George Novak, a supporter of the Fourth International who spoke as a critic of Shachtman, was not too far off the mark when he wrote that in his introduction to the 1973 edition of Trotsky's In Defense of Marxism, that the theoreticians of bureaucratic collectivism in 1940, quote, captured, end quote, Max Shachtman. Footnote. Leon Trotsky in Defense of Marxism, Pathfinder Press, 1973. All right. No more footnotes, so that's good. We'll have to keep pausing. The fact that Shachtman could be challenged on this question, that a heated debate could take place on the issue, and that the organization could eventually overturn Shachtman's position without the debate generating into the abusive brawl and split that were typical of the Trotskyist movement, is itself a symptom of how radical the break had been with the past practice of the Comintern. The truth is that the, quote, theoreticians of bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, didn't quite capture Shachtman. Drucker's treatment of this episode is very confusing. It deserves quoting in full as an example of how the author's plausible story falls apart under scrutiny. Shachtman's conclusions, laid out in the December 1940 New International, were that the Soviet Union was not a workers' state. There could be no workers' state without workers' political power. It was not capitalist, it was a new bureaucratic ruling class that had to be overthrown in order to create workers' democracy, or move to socialism. Even though every vestige of working-class political power had disappeared in the USSR, the collectivized property created by the revolution survived. Shachtman therefore called the USSR, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote. The economy and the state were the collective property of the bureaucracy. Though bureaucratic mismanagement undermined this new form of property, it was showing its superiority for economic and human progress over the anarchy of capitalism. It enabled Shachtman to characterize the USSR as a transitional society, a peculiar product of the epoch in which the world was moving from capitalism to socialism. Marxists therefore had defended against any attempt to restore private property. I'm assuming that whole last paragraph from starting with Shachtman's conclusions. I don't know. It says worth quoting in scrutiny, but then there doesn't seem to be anything to indicate that the last thing that was said was a quote in terms of formatting. So I'm not sure. Maybe that was a quote. I'm assuming that was a quote, but it might not be. That might have been Drucker. It might have been Haberkern. I don't know. While the book under review is liberally peppered with footnotes, this crucial semi-quote is not referenced. It couldn't be. It doesn't exist. It's an amalgam of two different and opposed statements, but to be fair, this isn't entirely Drucker's fault. What happened was this. In December of 1940, Shachtman wrote an article attacking Carter's position because Carter argued the working class had nothing to defend in the collectivized property of the Soviet Union. As long as the working class was deprived of all power in the state and even of such means of self-defense as independent trade unions it had been able to build in capitalist societies, collectivized property was for the working class simply an instrument of its exploitation. Shachtman did not in this article use the term bureaucratic collectivism. Shachtman called the new system bureaucratic state socialism. This was not an exercise in sectarian hair splitting. Shachtman used a different term because he was openly defending a different position. However, Shachtman soon began to adopt the new coinage without reservation. As Carter pointed out, this only concealed the fact that Shachtman was defending as much of Trotsky's old theory as could be defended. Trotsky's old slogan, quote, defend the workers' state, end quote, became, quote, defend the historically progressive collectivized property, end quote. 20 years later, in 1962, Shachtman printed a collection of his articles. The first article was titled, Is Russia a Workers' State? It purported to be a reprint of his 1940 article, but it was a bowdlerization of that article. Bowdlerization means like, kind of like, I'm not exactly sure what bowdlerization means, but what I do know what he's referring to is Shachtman edited those pieces to fit a new perspective. Bowdlerize, remove material that is considered improper or offensive from a text or account, especially with the result that the text becomes weaker or less effective. Yeah. So that's exactly specific and proper use of that term. The term, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, replaced, quote, bureaucratic state socialism, end quote, and the passage extolling the historical achievements of collectivized property, even under bureaucratic mismanagement, was excised. By 1962, Shachtman was already far along the way to becoming just another, quote, socialist, end quote, defender of American foreign policy. He certainly wasn't about to emphasize his earlier views, although I know of no passage where he repudiated his defense of the historically progressive role of collectivized property. He couldn't reprint Carter's articles not only because they weren't his, but because he no longer agreed with their hostility to capitalist imperialism. In his book, Shachtman stole Carter's term and buried his politics. Doesn't Drucker realize what happened? The passage above amalgamates the 1940 article with its bowdlerized 1962 reprint. Drucker must have read both. He didn't see the contradiction. In his mock quote, the term bureaucratic collectivism and the defense of collectivized property appear together. That combination doesn't occur in either of Shachtman's versions. There are other examples of serious confusion. New section, quote, defeatism and, quote, defensism. Throughout the debate over the, quote, defense of the workers' state, end quote, from 1937 up to 1949, when Shachtman finally abandoned his position, while still refusing to vote for Carter's alternative, the ghost of Lenin's anti-war polemics of 1914 to 1916 lurked in the corridors. In 1951, Shachtman summoned up his ghost in order to defend his turn toward the right. Drucker makes a model of this whole episode. Shachtman began with a modest proposal to support a, quote, labor government, end quote, even if it, quote, should not yet be a socialist government, end quote. Since the Labour Party was at the time in power in Britain and militarily aiding the corrupt and brutal dictatorship of Syngman Rhee in Korea as part of the United Nations, read American imperialist force, Shachtman was proposing to abandon the third camp position in favor of support to the imperialist camp led by America. Everyone who recognized this immediately, and according to Hal Draper, who was present, everyone was shocked. Draper said out loud that what the rest were thinking. He added language which confined support to a government, quote, which takes over the nation and defends the interests of the working people on the basis of a genuinely democratic course in foreign and domestic policy, which is not in fact subordinated to the interests of capitalism and imperialism, end quote, Draper. What does Drucker make of this discussion? Drucker claims Shachtman began by proposing to, quote, support in war any government that adopted a democratic foreign policy, end quote. But this is exactly the condition the condition Shachtman didn't make. Draper proposed it in opposition to his motion, and Shachtman voted against it. Drucker concludes there wasn't much difference between Draper and Shachtman. That is certainly true in Drucker's book because he has eliminated the difference. Now, this is not a debate over a trivial or irrelevant issue. Today, the overwhelming majority of the left, prominent veterans of the movements against the Vietnam War, are urging NATO, i.e. U.S. intervention in Haiti and Bosnia, using essentially Shachtman's 1951 arguments. What was involved in this debate was the basic anti-imperialist position of the socialist movement. Drucker not only misreports the facts, he doesn't appear to be cognizant of what the debate is about. Shachtman was not a man to take defeat lying down. Shachtman counterattacked in an article entitled, quote, Socialism and War, end quote. In this article, Shachtman argued that the old World War I position no longer held. To, quote, wish defeat, end quote, as Lenin had in the war where both sides were equal evils made sense. In a struggle between Stalinist Russia and capitalist democracy, it didn't. In a four-part article, Draper outlined what Lenin's slogan had meant in World War I, why it was mistaken then, and why it was leading Shachtman astray in 1951. How does Drucker deal with this material? Draper tried to clarify the issues at stake with a series of articles on, quote, revolutionary defeatism, end quote. The old principle that communists should fight against war and capitalism even by means, e.g. strikes in vital industries, that might risk their own country's defeat. Draper suggested the idea of, quote, defeatism, end quote, had always been confusing and that Shachtman was turning its ambiguities upside down in a way that undermined opposition to U.S. wars. The idea was controversial when Lenin first put it forward during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Trotsky and Luxemburg opposed it during the First World War on the grounds that socialists should prefer the war to end without victory or defeat for any of the capitalist powers. Now Drucker is no obligation to agree with Hal Draper's historical account. On the contrary, he has an obligation to consider with a jaundiced eye all the participants in a heated debate. But there is also an obligation on the part of the historian to make clear what the parties are saying. And this Drucker doesn't do. Drucker's account slanders not only Hal Draper, but Leon Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg. And Drucker doesn't do justice to Lenin or Shachtman either. Fortunately, Humanities Press will shortly be publishing Draper's series of articles in book form, so I need only give a short account here. What Draper demonstrates is that initially meant by, quote, defeatism, end quote, support for the other side in the war. That is what is meant in 1904 when Lenin and other leading figures of the Second International, not all, openly support the Japanese as a, quote, progressive, end quote, force against, quote, reactionary end quote, Tsarism. At the start of World War I, Lenin, in a rage over the betrayal of the patriotic socialists, called for the defeat of Tsarism. It sounded about as, quote, hard, end quote, as you could get. Unfortunately, as both friends and enemies were quick to point out, the worst of the German socialists were saying the same thing. They thought the defeat of Russian Tsar was a blow for freedom, too. Dude, that's fucking important. Unfortunately, as both friends and enemies were quick to point out, the worst of the German socialists were saying the same thing. They thought the defeat of the Russian Tsar was a blow for freedom, too. Lenin responded by qualifying the term out of existence until he finally dropped it in 1916. The version of the, quote, defeat, end quote, slogan Drucker describes as the old communist position was neither. It was the weakest of Lenin's reformulations of the, quote, old position of the communist movement, end quote, that Lenin had just invented, and that was his and his alone. Shachtman, of course, was interested in reviving this confused slogan in its original version. Lenin's original, quote, lesser evil, end quote, slogan seemed to justify Shachtman's move toward the defense of democracy. This was only the mirror image of his defense of collectivized property in 1940. There's a quote here in the middle of the piece, which I guess is like what is viewed as like a prime takeaway of the text is, quote, by 1957, Shachtman was looking for, quote, revolutionary, end quote, arguments to support the U.S. government, end quote. Okay, back to the main text. Trotsky in 1916 pointed out exactly what was wrong with Lenin's slogan. The pity is that a self-confessed adherent of the Fourth International should slander Trotsky. His position was the clearest in 1914 to 1917. When Lenin charged Trotsky in the heat of the battle, With defending the, quote, neither victory nor defeat, end quote, slogan, it was a low blow. Drucker does not have Lenin's excuse. The slogan, quote, neither victory nor defeat, end quote, was raised by pacifists and Mensheviks. Trotsky and Luxemburg both opposed it. Quote, neither victory nor defeat, end quote, meant return to the status quo. Neither side should benefit. It meant in practice, as Trotsky argued eloquently, appeasing the great powers in the interest of peace. It was the exact analog of Chamberlain's appeasement policy in 1938, or, quote, peaceful coexistence, end quote, in the 1950s and 1960s. Trotsky was not for appeasing either imperialist camp, nor was he for the victory of either imperialist camp. He was for the victory of the working class over both. This is just a side statement of my own kind of things. Like, I don't really know how to, comprehend this kind of, third campus position when the working class is politically weak and disorganized and not in any way, not in any substantial way, engaging in things beyond, bread and butter issues. What I'm saying is that, when you talk about, Russia and the Ukraine, you'll hear some people say, either revolutionary defeatism or neither victory nor defeat or something like that. Both of those things, which is it seems like neither victory nor defeat seems like the best thing in my opinion. This kind of naive notion that the working class of Russia or the working class of and Ukraine are suddenly about to rise up and overthrow both of their respective governments or something of that sort. It seems like, I guess this is I'm not one of those people who bases their political ideas around pessimism, around what the optimistic conclusion would be, right? It seems like a lot of Marxists do that, is what they have these wishes for the world, and what they want, regardless of how unrealistic it is, they stick by it. And it's I'm in favor of sticking by unrealistic, or maybe positions that are in a weak position, and sticking to your guns. But it seems to me a really big mistake to I don't know. Obviously Luxemburg and Trotsky in this period are operating at a totally different time, where there is substantial, a relatively unified working class movement around the Second International prior to its collapse, or there's at least enough dissidents who reject the war within the working class movement, where you could kind of have these kind of positions of this kind of revolutionary idea of the outcome of the war. But it seems in a lot of these modern cases, for instance in whether it be whatever these wars be, there is no revolutionary socialist horizon immediately visible emanating from them. There's no CNT FAI. There's no there's no workers councils emerging or something like that, or even to my understanding any kind of mass strike activity, or any kind of real signs of this independent third camp working class movement. So it seems obviously the status quo is obviously undesirable, but I see no immediately progressive consequences coming out of any of the current conflicts that are existing in the world. And it seems what is the best that one can hope for in this juncture is the minimizing of death and current death and future death, right? I don't see it's I see no socialist solution, maybe something like a democratic solution, but I see definitely no socialist solution emerging out of, say, Israel and Gaza conflict, or coming out of the war in the Ukraine. I see no Like, the idea that there's going to be some socialist revolution, the best that can happen is that the war ends, and hopefully there's some kind of like uh, stable peace in which not where a bunch of people aren't going to die for fucking spurious expansionist due to Russian expansionism, right? Um, but for me, like, I think this is maybe a distinction for me personally, is that the pacifist response, the response that just like opposes the wars for humanitarian purposes, is the way to go if there is not some kind of like um clearly, if there's not a a working class force that could immediately in the future do anything to step beyond the pre-existing status quo, right? Like, I don't know, like, I didn't like I just think that sometimes, like, I don't know, like, I don't know, I'm just talking to myself now, but I'm confused on this thing, like, for me, like, the grounds for opposing the Iraq War or something like that, right, is not like that you see something progressive in Saddam Hussein's government, right? Or that you see that, like, a replacement of Saddam Hussein's by some toppling of the Saddam Hussein's government. Um, well, hold on, let me say that. It's not because you view for like anti-imperialist reasons, right? For like curbing the power of America or whatever, which is like whether or not America invades, it does nothing about its like power, right? It still has the power to do so if it should so desire. Um, for me, it seems like what is going to be the human cost of an invasion, right? Like that's should be that to me. That is what is like the determining factor when discussing these things. Is like, um, is um, like that's why you would oppose something like that, not because you think there's some kind of good outcome that's going to come out of it, right? Like, not because you think that like resisting it is going to produce some kind of super progressive outcome or something like that. It's just like prevent the destruction of life. Um, which I think is why people like usually oppose wars or getting interested in anti-war politics in general, is because of the human cost, not because of some kind of like grand scheme of like the play of forces on the world arena or something like that. Then somehow like there being a multipolar world of more competitive. A more competitive terrain in the international arena between nation states, as opposed to a more monopolistic situation, as in the case of instances of superpowers and empires or something like that. Empires. Um, I think for me, like when you have the like, sometime like you have to have your own politics. You can't just like I think there's obviously limits in pacifist politics, in the grand scheme of things, right? Like I would certainly support, um, I support revolutionary socialism. Um, but like, yeah, like, um, for me, it should be like I don't like, barring that kind of circumstance, that like real evidence of that being a situation, um, you know, like a possibility, a real possibility at a particular point in time, not a possibility in like the general sense of it could happen, but in the sense of like a real probability of something like that happen and evidence of that probability, substantial, like, I don't know, uh, then I don't think, then I think that sometimes that the like the pacifist, the heuristic, the rule of thumb of pacifism is a good um, rule of thumb to avoid at least making disgusting political conclusions until you have further information, right? Like, like for me, the progressive thing in the Ukraine, for instance, would like be, the ending of the war, and the disempowering of Russia to do something like that again. Um, and I think that's all that can be hoped for, in my opinion. I don't think there's anything revolutionary or world changing about this conflict. It's just like a fucking spiral of dying. Um, and I think that kind of just like that suffering is what should be opposed. I don't know. I'm just talking on my ass, so I've been rambling way too long. But I struggle with how to think about this. Right? I really don't know what to think about it. Um, if you find like reactionary anti-imperialism wrong, right? If you find supporting people supporting any reactionary dictatorship that happens to be opposed to the U.S., if you find that disgusting, um, and you find like a lot of the political forces that oppose American imperialism disgusting, what kind of politics do you substantially embrace when those are like seem to be, at least and at present, the only game in town, right? It's like I don't know what to make of that. Like simply condemning, I don't know, pacifism seems like a good rule of thumb, but also just categorically condemning any conflict between states as if all states are the same seems too simplistic. I don't know. I don't really know. I don't know. I don't have to think about that. Basically, all I'm just saying, I'm just talking to myself. Sorry for interrupting this. I'm just talking to myself. Like, I don't know what to do about war and what should be the response to it. I don't feel simple about it. I feel torn and confused and isolated um, in terms of how to approach those types of things. It was the exact analog of Chamberlain's. Sorry, back to the text. It was the exact analog of Chamberlain. It's almost over, by the way. It was the exact analog of Chamberlain's appeasement policy in 1938, or quote peaceful coexistence, end quote, in the 1950s and 1960s. Trotsky was not for appeasing either imperialist camp. Neither was he for the victory of either imperialist camp. He was for the victory of the working class over both. Again, noble ambition, likelihood of probability, I don't know. Trotsky was almost, to my understanding, Trotsky was bewitched by like a very, very, by an optimism that could not be justified historically. Um, like um, like there was no working class revolution in um, in Europe after World War II, right? All it did is shifted borders around between states that are with varying degrees of supportability from a democratic perspective and from a social democratic perspective, but no working class victory. Um, but I think it's good that the Nazis were defeated, right? I think it's good. I think like it's complicated. I don't really know how to think about it, but I'm torn by the one hand between like broader criticism of uh, all exploitative authoritarian societies, and also understanding that they're not all the same. Like the Third Reich was not the same as Popular Front era France. Like you can't say that they're the same things. They might be the same in terms of like very in terms of like more like basic things. They have similarities, just like all societies have similarities, and they might have specific similarities um, due to the fact that they're both 20th century societies and states. Um, but I can't personally view them as the same. Uh, like for me, it's good. For me, it's good that the Nazis were defeated. It's not a lateral move just because it didn't result in socialism coming to fruition. You know, I don't know. I still have this extreme enthusiasm for the third camp and third camp politics, obviously, um, and for what they aspire to. But I'm also aware that very novel, extremely repressive forms of society came into existence in the 20th century that should be opposed, whether or not socialism is the fruit of them, is the fruit of that opposition. And even if that requires the intervention of states that you are highly critical of for other reasons. I don't know. But anyway, this thing's almost over, so let me wrap it up and I'll just talk to myself in the mirror. Shit. Drucker concludes by accusing Draper and Shachtman's other opponents of basically agreeing with Shachtman. Quote, everything Shachtman said about not helping the other side to victory was, quote, absolutely correct, end quote, Draper said, and, quote, should have held good in 1914, end quote, end quote. What should have held good in 1914? Drucker doesn't explain this truncated quote. The implication is that Draper, like Shachtman, was for backing away from Lenin's, quote, hard, end quote, anti-war stand. In fact, Draper, like Luxemburg and Trotsky, rejected the choice of supporting either side in an imperialist war. That was where Lenin's slogan led, even if Lenin didn't want to follow the thought out to its conclusion. Indeed, Lenin tended to blow up when his opponents accused him of meaning by, quote, defeatism and, quote, support for the rival imperialist power, even though that was what it had meant in 1904. Shachtman by this time did want to move in that direction. Revolutionary socialists, however, were for strikes, demonstrations, what have you, in 1951, as in 1914, not because they were for the victory of the other side, but because they were for the victory of the working class. Lenin was honestly confused. Shachtman, as his subsequent career indicated, was not confused. He was looking for, quote, revolutionary, end quote, arguments to support his own government. In 1951, Shachtman's evolution was just beginning. People were right to give an old comrade the benefit of the doubt. Why not call a spade in 1994? Why amalgamate the anti-imperialist Draper with the social patriotic Shachtman? The second part of this review will deal with the respective attitudes of Shachtman, the, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote, and the Trotskyists to the Stalinist movement. Drucker's account of Shachtman drifts to the right in his later years. Drucker's account of Shachtman's drift to the right in his later years, and Drucker's interpretation of socialism and the choices faced by Shachtman and his contemporaries. I don't know if this part 2 ever comes into being. Yeah, but yeah, I don't know. But thanks for listening to that review, and I hope you got something out of it. I got something out of it. I think it was interesting. I think I might try to read more book reviews. I find book reviews actually like extremely helpful because it actually makes me see like what is specific um, to these books, right? You know, sometimes when you're reading things, you're like, don't really know like how unique the argument is or what is unique or different or distinctive about what is being said. You kind of just take it for granted. I think the book reviews help. Thanks for listening. Hey everyone, this is the second part of Ernie Haberkern's critique of or review, critical review of Peter Drucker's Max Shachtman and His Left: A Socialist Odyssey Through the American Century, published in 1994. Hopefully I'll get the first section up before I get the second section up. Yeah. Usually they have a big fat quote in the middle of the text highlighting an important point. The important point here says, however confused Shachtman's theoretical position may have become in the early 50s, it did not prevent Shachtman from touring the country as an articulate and passionate defender of civil liberties and opponent of American imperialism. So that's the quote in the middle of the text. So here we go. This is like a brief. This first thing I'm going to read is like a brief abstract of the review. Two distinct currents emerged after 1940 from the Trotskyism of Trotsky. One was the quote official quote orthodox Trotskyism of James Cannon, Ernest Mandel, Michel Pablo, Jerry Healy, Ted Grant, etc. The other was mainly associated with the name of Max Shachtman. The British Socialist Workers' Party is a hybrid, owing more to the official orthodox Trotskyism of James Cannon, Ernest Mandel, Michel Pablo, Jerry Healy, Ted Grant, etc., than to the latter associated with Max Shachtman. The Shachtman current mutated into a number of tendencies. Shachtman himself ended his days as a sort of American Fabian, but its history remains a matter of great importance for those engaged in the work of renewing Trotskyism in the post-Stalinist world. This is the second part of Ernest Haberkern's examination of Max Shachtman and His Left: A Socialist Odyssey Through the, quote, American Century, end quote, by Peter Drucker, Humanities Press, New Jersey, 1994. James Buchanan is theoretician, first section. James Buchanan is theoretician of bureaucratic collectivism. Without doubt, the politically critical issue for Drucker, the issue around which the book is organized, is Shachtman's treatment of the Stalinist movement outside Russia. The last chapter of the first part, titled, quote, The Third Camp, end quote, and the whole of the second part constitute a debate between Drucker and Shachtman over the question. Drucker never quite states in so many words his belief that it was Shachtman's mistake on this matter that provided the ideological bridge to a pro-West position. He lets the story tell itself by carefully editing it. In these sections of the book, Drucker's tendency to describe as Shachtman's original contribution what was in reality first proposed by others, in this case again beginning with Joseph Carter, and initially opposed by Shachtman, leads him outside the boundaries of historical truth. It is not that he fails to mention the facts which contradict his portrait. He mentions, although sometimes only in reference, notes, the debates and articles in which Carter, Draper, and Geltman criticized Shachtman when he treated the Stalinist parties in France, Yugoslavia, China, and Indochina as if they were basically reformist working class parties or national liberation movements. It is just that in his extensive commentary and analysis, Drucker ignores this evidence and consistently describes Shachtman as generating the basic politics of the third camp unaided out of his own head. To anticipate the concluding section of this review, the only explanation is that Drucker agrees with Shachtman's original analysis. Shachtman's capitulation to the, quote, theoreticians of bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, is Shachtman's fall from grace. But how do you square that hypothesis with the fact that the real originators of the third camp view did not follow Shachtman into the abyss? Joseph Carter simply dropped out of politics for personal reasons. Nothing mysterious, no gossip, he just pooped out. Immanuel Geltman, although he left the Trotskyist movement before Shachtman did, devolved like the rest of the dissent editorial board into a garden-variety semi-socialist left liberal, who of course opposed the Vietnam War and the Bay of Pigs invasion. Hal Draper, who in the late 40s and early 50s wrote most of the theoretical articles for the Independent Socialist League, the major body of work on bureaucratic collectivism in the third camp, was Shachtman's major adversary up until the time when Shachtman's views were no longer of any interest to anyone on the left. If third camp politics tended to lead one to support American imperialist democracy against Stalinist totalitarianism, then it should have been Draper, not Shachtman, who fell. The facts just don't fit the script Drucker wants to write. What was the fight all about? Drucker at one point accuses Shachtman of fearing, quote, a Stalinist victory in the United States and the consequent destruction of working-class organizations, freedoms, and living standards, end quote. Again, there is no reference given, and I know of no place where Shachtman or anyone else made such a claim. This is a straw man. The position Shachtman was argued into by Carter, Draper, and Geltman was that the Stalinist parties represented an anti-working class, anti-democratic movement which was also anti-capitalist. It was the politics of the Stalinist parties, not their prospects in any given country, that made it necessary to treat them as political opponents rather than as somewhat unreliable comrades in the struggle for human freedom. What really disrupted the opponents of the third camp, and disturbs Peter Drucker today, was the practical conclusion that they drew from their theory. Inside the labor movement, political collaboration with the Communist Party or its sympathizers was impossible. Unlike even the most conservative or bureaucratic union leader, they were not fundamentally loyal to the movement. The, quote, Shachtmanites, end quote, however, were not first to make this point inside the Trotskyist movement. One of the clearest expositions of this basic conclusion from the, quote, theory of bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, was given in 1940 by James P. Cannon. Drucker reports the incident, but not in connection with his exposition of the, quote, Shachtmanites, end quote, union politics. In 1940, Trotsky urged his American followers, organized as the Socialist Workers' Party, Trotsky urged his American followers, organized as the Socialist Workers' Party, to propose an alliance with the Stalinists on the basis of their common opposition to, quote, imperialism, end quote. This was a serious question. The Socialist Workers' Party in 1940 had significant support in the Teamsters. They ran its most important section. In the Minnesota Farmer Labor Party and elsewhere, they were not an isolated sect whose views were of no interest to anyone but themselves. The difficulty was that the Communist Party's, quote, anti-imperialist, end quote, rhetoric in 1940 to 41 was an all too transparent cover for its pro-war position. If Lenin had been confused about his, quote, defeat, end quote, slogan in 1914, and Shachtman was unraveling politically when he picked it up in 1951, the Communists in 1940 were clear about what they were doing. They had no problem with fomenting strikes in crucial industries, such as aircraft, because in 1940 they were actively supporting the other side, just as Lenin had been supporting Japan in 1904. And the best trade unionists were horrified. They instinctively supported Roosevelt's tentative steps towards war and his aid to beleaguered Britain. To explain to the good people in the unions that the civil liberties and trade union gains could not be sacrificed to the, quote, war effort, end quote, that neither British nor American imperialism were fighting for anything but their own imperial ends, was an uphill battle. It required skill, tact, and above all, honesty. It would be suicide to ally yourself in any way with the people who were using, quote, anti-imperialist, end quote, rhetorical rhetoric demagogically in aid of the despised Berlin-Moscow axis. Kennan defended his refusal to support Trotsky's foolish proposal with essentially the same arguments Carter, Draver, Geltman, and eventually Shachtman were to use in the Cold War. Kennan argued that, quote, even the conservative labor fakers, end quote, were to be supported against the Stalinists. Why? Because the labor fakers, from self-interest, were loyal to the unions. Kennan was not questioning the personal loyalty of the Communist Partiers any more than the, quote, Shachtmanites, end quote, did later. Their self-sacrifice and devotion were well known. The question was, quote, to what were they loyal? In what cause were they sacrificing themselves, end quote. Trotsky backed down. Trotsky shifted his ground and criticized the American Trotskyists for their failure to confront the prejudices of the pro-New Deal Unionists. It was, of course, these left-leaning activists and officials that really concerned socialist workers' partiers in the union movement, not the, quote, conservative fakers, end quote. The discussion then turned to a practical discussion of how to accomplish the difficult task of explaining anti-war and anti-Roosevelt politics to left and liberal unionists. Exaggerations about, quote, conservative labor fakers, end quote, aside, Kennan had come to the same conclusion as the, quote, theoreticians of bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, not by theorizing, but by following the instincts of a serious, honest, loyal trade unionist of long standing. Those instincts served him in this instance better than Trotsky's theorizing. New section. To the right? Question mark. In his penultimate chapter, which he titles, quote, To the Right, end quote, Drucker paints a portrait of Max Shachtman in the 1950s as a man demoralized, used up and drifting to the right. He implies, although he does not say openly, that Shachtman's acceptance of the proposition that the Stalinist parties represented a social and political force at once reactionary and anti-capitalist was responsible for his political and personal collapse. And Shachtman, given Drucker's organizational views, was the Independent Socialist League. Drucker therefore simply ignores the Independent Socialist League in this period. The history is reduced to a silly tale of how Shachtman won over a new generation of young civil rights activists by his personal charm. Politics had nothing to do with it. But Shachtman was not the Independent Socialist League, and the Independent Socialist League's activities in this period were not confined to the civil rights movement, whose activists did have a special relationship with Shachtman, for political, not personal reasons. The Independent Socialist League and the Independent Socialist League's youth affiliates were the most influential political tendency in the civil rights movement, civil rights and peace movements at this time as well. Drucker acknowledges that in World War II, the Workers' Party filled a political vacuum. Drucker fails to recognize that the same was true in the Cold War period too. And for the same reason, their politics addressed issues that others could only hope to avoid. In the trade unions and in liberal political circles, the Independent Socialist League provided the only significant opposition to McCarthyism, the arms race, and especially the Korean War. Of course, the Communist Party and its supporters also protested the politics of the Cold War, and at least up until 1956, the Communist Party and its supporters were the largest tendency on the left by far. But the Communist Party and its supporters were also obviously partisans of the other side. Given what they were apologizing for, they suffered the same degree of isolation among honest trade unionists and left liberals as they had during the period of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. And for the same good reasons, people who could have been expected to leap to their defense held back, not only out of fear of persecution, but out of an inability to defend their politics. By opposing American imperialism while remaining silent on the crimes of the other side, the Stalinists and the Fourth Internationalists, who trailed along after them, simply took themselves out of the game. I suspect that Peter Drucker, as a member of the Fourth International, finds this fact hard to face up to, but as an historian, he cannot avoid dealing with it. The Independent Socialist Leaguers and the pacifists and left socialists who increasingly looked to them for political ideas became the center around which radicals gathered. It was because they filled this political vacuum that a new generation of radical activists in the civil rights movement and the peace and civil liberties movements were attracted to them. In the early 1950s, the entire youth movement of the Socialist Party, regularly called by itself and others the Socialist Party of Norman Thomas, joined the Independent Socialist League. They joined because it alone, on the anti-Stalinist left, stood up against the Korean War. Today that sounds easy. After the fiasco in Indochina, Cold War liberalism went into decline. In the 1950s, however, the best elements in the trade union movement and in American liberalism supported the war, even as they denounced the, quote, excesses, end quote, of McCarthyism. And Max Shachtman was one of the most prominent spokesmen of the Independent Socialist League in this period. Whatever political doubts Max Shachtman may have entertained, however confused his theoretical position might have become, neither prevented Shachtman from touring the country, speaking to unionists, civil libertarians, liberals, and students as an articulate and passionate defender of civil liberties and opponent of American imperialism. The shock which, as Drucker reports, greeted Shachtman's open break with his past, his support of the Bay of Pigs invasion, would not be understandable if he had not been up until then one of the most indefatigable and brilliant expounders of third camp politics. Drucker implies that Shachtman adopted his new line on the nature of the communist parties in 1949 because he wished to accommodate himself to the McCarthyite purge of the communists in the CIO. In particular, Drucker implies that Shachtman did this because he feared defense of the communist rights would jeopardize the Independent Socialist League activists in the United Auto Workers who supported the Reuther caucus. Get the hell out of here. But he does not mention that those Independent Socialist Leaguers who did not want to support Reuther shared the same view of the Communist Party and its role. And in fact, the Independent Socialist League newspaper, which was widely circulated among United Auto Workers members, continued to denounce the witch hunt in the unions and Reuther's part in it. Just because the Independent Socialist League thought that the Reuther caucus was the better choice on trade union issues and the communists disloyal to the working class and the unions did not mean that its members concealed their views. In fact, they argued that the expulsion of the communists from the union and their removal from office by bureaucratic means would weaken the union and the Reuther caucus itself. Sorry, there's a photo here of Max Shachtman that I want to save. Alright, sorry. In fact, they argued that the expulsion of the communists from the union and their removal from office by bureaucratic means would weaken the union and the Reuther caucus itself. Drucker does not quite come out and say that Shachtman and the Independent Socialist League after 1949 changed their line and supported the expulsion of communists. Drucker does not say that because of, as Richard Nixon once said, that, quote, he does not say that because, as Richard Nixon once said, quote, that would be a lie, end quote. But he does suppress the whole history of the Independent Socialist League's leading role in the fight against McCarthyism long after they adopted their 1949 position on the nature of the Stalinist movement. New section, reactionary anti-capitalist. The examples I have given here could be multiplied. Without going into detail, which would take a book twice as long as the one being reviewed, I can only mention a few more. Drucker's treatment of the, quote, Shachtmanites on, quote, Leninism, for example, which raises an extremely important question of contemporary relevance, is also largely unsubstantiated. He has Shachtman and, quote, other independent socialist leaders, end quote, abandoning the Leninist touchstone, quote, that revolution was necessary even in post-war capitalist democracies like the United States, end quote. The, quote, other leaders, end quote, are unnamed and no reference is given. This comes pretty close to slander. Lenin himself has grounds for legal action. At one point, Drucker repeats the standard bourgeois academic caricature of, quote, Leninism, end quote, as the doctrine that socialism has to be brought to the workers by an elite, quote, vanguard, end quote, of intellectuals. Lenin denounced this tendentious distortion of his use of a quote by Karl Kautsky almost as soon as it was made. It's true that this particular canard is so ingrained in the popular consciousness that it will take a major intellectual campaign involving several hundred volumes of research by socialists to eradicate it. But do socialists have to reinforce this kind of disinformation? The basic problem with this political biography, however, is more fundamental. What the Trotskyist movement in the 40s and 50s faced was the rise of a mass popular anti-capitalist movement that was also reactionary. A movement hostile to democracy, democracy, the legacy of the bourgeois revolution and bourgeois liberalism, and above all, hostile to the organized working class. Stalinism forced the Trotskyist movement, and finally everybody else, to face this phenomenon. But Stalinism was only one manifestation of the phenomenon, and its collapse, or partial collapse, does not eliminate the phenomenon itself. In 1968, Hal Draper published a pamphlet, The Two Souls of Socialism, that looked at the origins of the socialist movement from this perspective. Far from being unique or unusual or peculiar to Stalinism, the concept of socialism as an autocratic utopia brought from above to a more or less grateful people was the dominant concept in the movement. From this point of view, Stalinism, especially in its Asian varieties, has turned out to be the greatest utopian experiment in history. Marx and Engels were peculiar in their notion of socialism as a movement by the people organized to win freedom for themselves. They were the ones who were out of step. That their socialism was widely, if superficially, adopted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is a tribute to the inherent attractiveness of the idea and the growing self-confidence of the organized working class. The widespread repudiation of Marxism, either openly or through reinterpretation, is in turn a function of the demoralization and disorganization of the working class brought by 2 world wars and the economic, political, and social disasters that accompanied and followed them. It is this relative weakness of the working class combined with the continued hatred of the overwhelming majority of the world's people for capitalism that has given a new lease on life to the reactionary anti-capitalism that permeates the history of the socialist movement. It's just the specter of a reactionary anti-capitalist movement that haunted Shachtman, as it haunted Trotsky and continues apparently to haunt Drucker. For all three, the fear is that the existence of such a social alternative means that the working class has no political future. Whatever the logic behind such a view, it's clear that the fear is accentuated when the working class is weakened or temporarily defeated. The choice then seems to be support, quote, democracy, end quote, even in its attenuated form under modern capitalism, or throw in your lot with the bureaucracy in the hopes that the, quote, progressive, end quote, dynamic behind collectivized property will eventually transform the system. In both cases, the great danger is that the working class, which you have now decided is not capable of really independent politics, will in its blind struggle for, quote, more, end quote, weaken the side which you have determined is the only hope, and you will be the one who has to oppose the people fighting the system you have chosen as lesser evil. The history of the Trotskyist movement since 1940 is the history of people who have tried first one of these choices, and then the other. Trotsky, And Shachtman, for a long time, tried to avoid this dilemma by insisting that Stalinism was a peculiarly Russian system. It was a historical accident. It would have to disappear. Drucker would like to persuade himself that they were right. That is why he defends the Shachtman of 1940 and tries to fix the blame for Shachtman's lamentable end on his opponents who did not end up as apologists for imperialism. It isn't logical. It doesn't fit the facts, and that's why the book ultimately fails. But frightened people aren't logical. They grasp at straws. The left today would like to forget about Stalinism. Stalinism was a bad dream. Or as we Americans say, quote, that's history, end quote. Why waste your breath arguing with the surprisingly large number of people who see hope in the red-brown coalition in Russia, or Fidel's Cuba, or even the, quote, hardliners, end quote, in China, who resist the spread of wage slavery by defending slavery without unnecessary modifiers? Stalinism, for good or ill, has been defeated by triumphant capitalism. Let's concentrate on the real enemy. For a very short period after the collapse of the Soviet Union, such arguments had some force. But the predictions of a stable, prosperous, liberal, eternal, capitalist New World Order have proved as reliable as the economic projections of Stalinist central planners. The social forces that created Stalinism and fascism haven't stopped operating, even if neither Stalinism nor fascism are likely to return in the same form. The left cannot pretend that the world has reverted to 1900. As Trotsky and Shachtman at their best realized and argued, so long as the working class does not provide an independent political choice, we face a bleak future. That can be taken either as a counsel of despair or a call to action. There's some endnotes here. I don't know what they're in reference to, but I'll read them. There's just a few of them. But if you don't want to hear the endnotes, you can click out now or do whatever you want. Stop paying attention, whatever. Note 1. It is interesting to note here that Drucker completely passes over a very important episode in this development, Shachtman's adequacy of American military intervention in Hungary in 1956. It was an important turning point in the debate. It is another instance of Drucker's curious, quote, softness, end quote, when it comes to Shachtman's renegacy. But is there also a political problem? It is easy enough to decry Shachtman's support of the American imperialism when it intervened on the side of the bad guys, as it did in Vietnam or Cuba. But how do you deal with the problem when American imperialism has the opportunity to intervene on behalf of the good guys? I suspect Drucker isn't sure himself how to answer that question. Next footnote, or next endnote, and this is the final endnote. The political relationship was based on Shachtman's belief that the Democratic Party could be realigned through the civil rights movement. The idea was attracted to civil rights activists, but not to people in the peace movement. In my opinion, as a participant in the Socialist Party in the early 1960s, this is the bridge to the right not simply for Shachtman, but for a whole wing of socialist and, more importantly, civil rights activists. The conflict over Vietnam threatened to split the Democratic Party, not realign it. And that prospect frightened civil rights activists who had never heard of Trotsky or the, quote, theory of bureaucratic collectivism, end quote. To pursue this question further would lead to a book-length digression of, quote, what happened to the civil rights movement and the new left, end quote. Okay, the end.